People who have been in prison. What's the most disturbing thing you've seen or heard in prison? Story 1. I was in county jail in a rough part of Southern California. We had triple-stacked bunk beds in general population, all in a large open room. I had a middle bunk, and often at night, guys would try to stealthily take care of themselves. The bed shaking is a dead giveaway, and usually you just try to ignore it. Well, one night I was reading, and the bed started shaking vigorously, which is not how it usually happens. As I was putting my book down to tell this guy to knock it off, he fell off his bunk and hit his head on the concrete floor. He had a seizure on the top bunk and fell down about 7 feet straight to the concrete, head first. That was a disturbing sight to see. Edit. I really didn't think this needed to be said since it's spelled out, but he was not doing anything inappropriate. The shaking from his bunk was due to the seizure, which led him to roll off and land head first. Story 2. I used to be a correctional officer in Singapore, where judicial caning is still used as a punishment for certain crimes and prison offenses. I never had to carry it out myself, but I witnessed it many times. Among the inmates, they would act like they weren't afraid of it, like it wasn't a big deal, just to save face. But privately in the caning room, they are caned in private, not in front of other inmates. I've never seen anything else that could make hardened criminals break down and cry like the cane can. For those who don't know, it's much more severe than the public whipping used in some countries. That's more for humiliation, while caning is designed to cause maximum pain. I saw grown men cry, beg, plead, throw up, and even pass out from the pain. They have to keep a doctor on hand. Smaller offenders who got 3 strokes would be okay after a miserable week or 2. Rapists who got the 24-stroke maximum, though, were never the same. Story 3. Not prison, but I did a month in jail. My cellmate would steal the candy I bought from the commissary that I had hidden under my pillow while I was sleeping. I caught him once, and we got into an argument. He threatened to rip off my head and do something unspeakable. This same guy was also making pruno in our cell. When I found out, I told him to dump it out. He said he would, and claimed he did. But he just packed soap around it and hid it to cover the smell. I dumped it out on him while he was in the shower. During that same stint, a guy from solitary was brought into our block. He got into an argument with his new cellmate about who got the top or bottom bunk. The solitary guy was about 6 feet 3 inches. The other was about 5 feet 6 inches and had just come from the shower, wearing only a towel and with wet feet. The solitary guy threw one punch and completely knocked him out. There was also a guy who came into our block and smuggled in Suboxone using his body. He passed it in the shower, which angered a lot of us. When the guards found out, they tried to take him out, but he attempted to run for it. Story 4. While working in maintenance, I saw everything. Inmates committing suicide, inmates getting beaten to death, officers having inappropriate relations with inmates, officers with other officers while on duty, a female inmate being seriously harmed, a notorious offender having boiling water thrown on him, guys inserting objects where they shouldn't, a coworker getting hit in the face with a used item, a female inmate breaking free from 3 guards and rushing me, a male inmate sneaking up behind me with a weapon, an inmate knocking out a guard with a roundhouse hit, and I even accidentally intercepted a drug ring. By far, the worst was seeing a head count gone wrong. They had the inmates line up in the yard. 2 inmates were holding another guy up, arms around him like friends. They finished the count, the 2 let go, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes. He ended up with massive brain injuries. The things I saw in juvenile facilities don't even compare. Now that place is truly messed up. Story 5. Second night I was in, I heard officers yelling, "Disengage," over and over. I looked at my cellmate, who had been down for 20 years for murder, and asked what was going on. He told me that when they catch a couple of guys doing something inappropriate, they yell that to get them to stop. This same cellmate once started growling like a dog at my foot while I was lying on the top bunk. Then he pretended to bite my foot. When he did, my toe went into his mouth and caused him to gag. One time during count, 2 guys started making tattoo ink by burning baby oil, but when the fire got too big, they threw water on it. It spread all over their cell, and they were locked inside with flames covering the walls. They were supposed to get out in a couple of months, but ended up getting a 10-year sentence for arson after the incident. Story 6. My crazier stories are actually from juvie and JDOC, surprisingly. We had a kid in juvie who got a 23-month sentence for stealing a car. He tried to hurt himself by falling off the bunk, which is only like a foot and a half high, onto the toilet. I'm guessing he thought it would break his neck, all over 23 months. He ended up on Suic Watch, where they put you in a single cell outside the guardroom and have a camera on you 24/7. I don't know how other juvies work, but in that cell, there's a button you have to press to request to move from the bed, use the toilet, etc. He ended up with a massive bump on his head the size of a cantaloupe. I've seen a 15-year-old go into juvie, and on his court date, he was given 6 years for armed robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. I've never seen someone give up on life so instantly. That kid's teenage years were gone in a second. In J-Doc, we had this kid named Junior who showed up thinking we were in some kind of movie. The first thing he did was try to fight one of the gang leaders, and he regretted it fast. They all jumped him and beat him badly. For his entire sentence, not a single day went by without him getting attacked. It got so bad that the DOs eventually put him in isolation for his own safety. Story 7. I spent 27 days in minimum security in Dubai before my country's consulate helped get me out. It was surreal, mostly boring, except when it wasn't. Minimum security was run by head inmates. Each wing had 2 chiefs. The wings weren't supposed to mix, but when I arrived, they were on good behavior, and the chiefs had negotiated having the wings joined, so it felt like an open prison. On day 12, someone from my wing was accused of stealing from the other wing, and chaos broke out. The longer-term residents, who had been calm, suddenly turned on each other. The accused guy was nearly lynched and had to be rescued. A massive brawl broke out. People used broom handles and sharpened phone cards as weapons. Both wings got locked down. Several people ended up in the hospital. The disturbing part was that the wing chiefs had to resolve the conflict to satisfy the corrections officers. They reached a verdict that the accused would be flogged. It didn't matter whether he actually did anything. Someone had to be punished. I don't know if he was guilty, but 2 days later, he was taken to the exercise yard, and the other inmates whipped him with a cane until he passed out. Then the wings reopened like nothing happened. But that still wasn't as bad as being inside Dubai police station. I spent 11 days there waiting to be charged. Each wing of the station has 12 beds. It's not designed to hold people, but there were about 400 inside. Some were being transferred between max and minimum security. Others were waiting for charges. It was a mix: creditors, addicts, violent offenders, all held together with no separation. One wing was for local inmates and far less crowded. There was someone in that wing being assaulted every night. His screams echoed through the whole complex. I don't know how long he had been in there. Some people in that station had been waiting for months. Story 8. Kitchen staff would pour dish soap on the extra food after meals. So people couldn't eat it out of the trash in the back. Another thing was the number of people who abused psychiatric medications for recreational purposes. Zoloft, Effexor, Lamictal. Cogentin was the worst. People would take 20 of them and come out to the day room tripping so hard they couldn't remember what they just said every time they spoke. They'd talk about going to their boat, having conversations with someone in the chow hall, then get up and walk a lap around the day room like they were about to go somewhere and try to go into other people's cells, completely forgetting where they were. And of course, the stabbings. Sometimes in the chow hall, and you wouldn't even know it happened. It was so fast. Then it just became the thing everyone talked about for days, like it was something to feed off. One kid who had just arrived a week earlier got stabbed in the face 13 times in the middle of the night, a few cells down from mine. His cellmate believed the FBI placed him there for surveillance. The look on his face when they pulled him out was haunting. I bumped into him years later, and he said he didn't like to talk about it. Story 9. Not me, but my brother. He was in and out of jail for a few months at a time for different reasons. Happy to say he's sober, out of a toxic relationship, and doing well now. But I remember how he described the echo of screams and moans from mentally ill people in the pitch black. It was so unnerving. It made me feel both sad and terrified, especially since the dark is one of my biggest fears. I spent a few days in a holding cell. I didn't eat, didn't use the bathroom, and I wasn't offered a shower the whole time. I couldn't pass my health exam due to a fever, so I was never moved to general population. The drunk man in the cell next to me screamed for what felt like the entire 3 days he was there. He insisted over and over that he wasn't drunk driving. This was likely very late on New Year's Eve, and judging by how the officers spoke to him, he was a regular. I couldn't sleep or concentrate on my book. My Crocs had 32 holes in them, and my cell was 14.5 bricks long. Storytime. One evening after lights out, all of us in the dorm were asleep or just getting there when, out of nowhere, I heard a loud thump against the partition that separated my bed from my neighbor's. I was jolted awake, listened, and then heard the bang again, and again, and again in faster succession. When I felt my bed shaking slightly, I had to sit up in my bunk and peek over the partition to see what was going on. When I did, it was Doug. He was seated on the bed with his back against our shared partition. He was covered in blood. The cabinet was covered in blood. The bed and the floor, too. What I heard was the sound of his convulsions from blood loss. I immediately called out to my other cellmate to wake up. I said, Chris, hey, bro. He looked over the other partition, and I said, bro, Doug's not okay. He said, huh? I repeated, Doug's not okay. As soon as I said it again, I ran to wake up our other cellmates. Iron Horse was the first to go look. He crept over, saw it, and ran back. Then we all started beating on the door and pressing the emergency button. After about 10 seconds, a quivering old man with a scruffy mullet, wearing a CO uniform, came to the window and yelled for us to get back away from the window. I remember the way he was holding his belt like he was ready to pull something, but all he had was a little can of pepper spray. He radioed to get our door opened and went to look for himself. Seeing the situation startled him, and he rushed out of the dorm yelling into his radio, 1053, 10/53, medical. Hours later, after they got Doug out and cleaned up most of the blood, one of the other COs walked us back into the dorm. We had waited in the day room. Doug actually survived the attempt, and we all got 10 days of good time for saving his life. Story 11. I was imprisoned for a few months in Brixton Prison, London. My cell was at the end of the oldest wing of the prison, built in 1836. One night in the early hours, I was awoken by a noise outside my cell. It sounded like a guard walking by and banging his baton on the rails outside my door, like a kid running a stick along a fence. It was really irritating. I got up on my bunk and looked through the porthole in my door to see which officer it was. I was surprised to see that nobody was out on the landing, though the knocking sound continued. The next morning, I mentioned it to some other prisoners, a couple of whom said they had heard it too. An officer nearby overheard us and said, "Oh, that'll be old John up to his usual tricks." He explained that old John was a prison guard who used to wake prisoners by banging his nightstick along the landing rails just to annoy them. Old John had been murdered by a prisoner in 1889. The officer went on to say that when they hear old John is around, they stay in the landing office until the noise stops. Story 12. In the jail I was at, the commissary was purchased through a kiosk. The jail charged inmates $3 a day in order to purchase commissary. You had to pay off this debt before you could buy anything. If you were in debt, you could just put money on another person's account and buy commissary through them. You usually paid them a percentage of the total order, typically 10 to 20%. One guy was in debt, we'll call him Jim, and he asked another guy, who I'll refer to as Carl, if he could purchase off his account. Carl agreed, and Jim ordered about $65 worth of food. The problem was, Carl had issues with a buddy of mine, Nick. Nick threatened to beat him up. Carl felt unsafe and asked the officers if he could leave the unit. This meant that Jim's order would be delivered to the wrong unit, and Carl wouldn't be able to pass it on. Never in my life have I seen a group of people direct so much anger at one person. Carl had to lock himself in his cell because Nick and everyone else were making serious threats. Most disturbing were my buddy Terry's words. "That's on my kids. I'm gonna find you and ruin your life. I'll take that cell time. Forget your family. You're nothing. I'm coming for you." The whole pod had to be locked down. Carl left to a chorus of curses and threats, many directed at his family and his future. Story 13. I spent nearly 12 years in prison in the state of Florida, from age 18 to 29. I've seen some seriously strange things. There was a guy they called the Jacksonville guy. He cut the pockets out of his pants and tied strings around himself to get attention from the guard towers at Okaloosa CI. Then there was a time when two smaller guys got into a fight. They went at it for a couple of minutes, and when it ended, there was a small mess on the floor that neither of them admitted to. It was oddly funny. Lastly, I'll leave you with this. I came around the corner in a dorm at Cross City and saw a guy I had some respect for on all fours doing something I didn't expect. I turned and walked away fast. I caught up with him later and asked what was going on. He said he just wanted to see what it felt like. Those are just a couple of the stories. Story 14. I was in holding once when I lived in Philly. Not prison, but I really turned my life around. I got picked up for tagging, and the school I went to had a police station instead of a security team. So when I got caught, I was immediately taken into custody. They transferred me to the city's holding cell so my mom could bail me out later that day at her discretion. Unfortunately for me, that meant my mom decided to teach me a lesson first, so I stayed there much longer than I should have and got a hard look at two individuals in particular. The first girl placed in my cell was a younger black girl, maybe 13, tall and thin. My mind raced with questions. What could she have done to end up here? After some time, she asked me what I was in for. I found out her only offense was telling her principal off. We became fast friends and started venting about how unfair her situation was. She was terrified of being processed into general population later that night. So I tried to reassure her and keep her calm. The second girl wasn't as innocent and was shoved into our cell with force, fighting the cops the entire way. She was a very petite Asian girl with blood on her face and shoes. The first girl and I stared at her, then looked at each other in silence, until she eventually broke down and started crying. We sat next to her, comforting her with gentle words and pats on the shoulder. We didn't ask what happened until later, when she was brought back in, sobbing uncontrollably. We finally asked what was wrong. She snapped, "I hit my twin sister in the head with a metal pipe, and she's in the hospital. My dad said if she dies, he's leaving me here. She threw it at me first." We were horrified and sat in silence. She eventually opened up and said they had fought after school, and in the heat of the moment, her sister threw the pipe. She picked it up and hit her multiple times, then went into her room to call her boyfriend, changed her shirt, and waited until her father came home and found one daughter unconscious and the other covered in blood, acting like nothing happened. While telling the story, she continued to blame her sister, as if she wasn't at fault. Eventually, the officers took her down the hall for a long time. When we saw her again, she was being led toward the prison wing in hand and ankle cuffs, head hung low, crying loudly. We never saw her again, and I have no idea what happened, but I'm almost certain her sister died that day. Story 15. I used to be a correctional officer for a few years. Not my proudest moments. I guess the most shocking things besides drugs and what people will do to get them, hide them in body cavities, or even throw up and have someone eat it for honey buns just to get the meds they just took, is the amount of self-harm. I've witnessed hangings, some fatal, some not, hanging from sinks or bunks with bed sheets, or once from the top tier. I've had guys cut their throat in front of me and their arms the long way. I've broken up an attempted assault, way more than that too. And this was in a small state, in what most people call a daycare, I guess. I can't imagine what it's like in larger states with more gang activity. We had small fights, but nothing too extreme. Mostly self-harm. Story 16. Not me, my uncle. He told me that when he was in prison, he had a cellmate who always wet the bed. The other inmates would make fun of him, laugh at him for it, and bully him. One day, my uncle asked him why he didn't just get up and use the bathroom. The toilet was literally in the same room. He told my uncle that he couldn't control it and that he had been doing it since he was a kid. My uncle was confused that a grown man still wet the bed. A few days later, he was talking with one of the prison guards, and the topic of the bedwetter cellmate came up. The guard told him that he had heard from others that the man had been assaulted by his older brother as a child, and that bedwetting was sometimes a long-term result of that kind of trauma. My uncle never brought up bedwetting or anything related to that topic again. Story 17. Basically what happened to me. I was doing a 2-year sentence at a medium security camp. Even though it was relatively safe and most of what happened was fights, I didn't know anything about prison or gangs. I was what you'd call green. So within a week, a 60-year-old man started talking to me. We chatted and everything seemed fine, but a few days later, he asked to talk in his room. He said he saw a certain gang come up to my cell, 2-man cells, and check if I lived there. He claimed he was in another gang and that he heard they were going to hurt me or make me do things unless I agreed, or else they'd run me off the yard. I was 23 and 120 pounds, so a small dude, and I was terrified. He said he talked to them and that something had to happen, but he took on the responsibility. I told him no multiple times. He said it was either that or let them do worse. I was left completely scared and broke down in my room. The next day, he told me to just get it over with. I said no and walked out, but he pushed me back in. Mind you, I was in a working dorm and was a houseman, so everyone else was out working. He made threats, faked like he was going to hit me, and I was so scared that I just broke down. Eventually, I gave in. He made me do something, and afterward, he made me turn around and used ointment and did more while he finished. I sat in the corner crying, wishing it would all end. I didn't want to, but I was too scared of being hurt by a gang. That same day, the officers did some moving around and transferred him. Later, my new bunkmate asked what was going on. I told him. Soon, the whole wing came to my room and started asking questions. They explained how gangs work and that they don't allow that kind of behavior. Turns out the guy lied about being in a gang and about anyone wanting to hurt me. The entire prison, 400 people, heard about it. During rec yard, my dorm stood behind me and made him come to the window while they called him out. Some gang members accused him of lying about who he was. Even a sergeant overheard it and said he'd look the other way if something were to happen. He ended up checking in and getting transferred. I heard he didn't survive at the next camp. Until my release, everyone made sure I was safe. Somehow, I became known throughout the camp. To this day, it still haunts me. I haven't told my family or girlfriend. I thought I had to deal with it alone because it's prison. But I wasn't alone. Story 18. Heard a story from a good friend who is a Christian missionary. He was in a foreign country. I can't remember where, but it was on an island in the Pacific Ocean. While he was there, he visited the local prison to help out with ministry. During one sermon, he sat next to a prisoner who kept asking questions about the message. Halfway through their conversation, my friend asked the prisoner why he was in prison. The reason? Cannibalism. It scared my friend badly because the guy seemed pretty normal to him. My brother had a similar story from when he was in jail for a DUI. While he was waiting to be bailed out, he got to talking with a guy who seemed friendly. Eventually, the conversation turned to why they were locked up, and the guy casually said that he beat up his girlfriend because she wouldn't leave the house. Story 19. Something positive that I actually saw, because a lot of this is going to be negative. I just thought I'd interject this. The amazing ability of some of those women in there. I've got to tell you, they can do some incredible things. One woman could literally take a piece of string from your clothing, just one string, and have you lie down, and she would pluck and shape your eyebrows. They were the best I have ever seen in my life. Another woman was giving tattoos in there, and it was honestly amazing. It didn't even look like jailhouse work by the time she was done. I was pretty shocked. It's amazing when you put people in a big box and make them sit with each other for a while. People adapt, and it's kind of incredible what they can do under pressure. I thought that was pretty cool. These people were, by all means, forgotten by society. Deadbeats, if you will, but here they were, doing a better job at things like eyebrow shaping than I've seen on the outside. It's pretty wild. One of the best things that came out of my time there was meeting people who truly understood loyalty. When it came down to it, they were some of the best people and friends I've ever made, whether it was just a weekend stint or longer. I met some amazing people with a strong moral code, especially around loyalty and friendship. And being Italian, that means a lot to me. You don't find that kind of loyalty much anymore, sadly. Story 20. A guy got murdered over a DVD player. Some young kid stabbed him in the chest and hit something vital. The kid, 19, had stolen the DVD player from the man's cell. He was new on the wing. The guy told the guards it was missing. The kid tried to act tough and ended up ruining his life. He was originally in for a minor charge, but now he's doing 20 to life. Also, drugs are everywhere in prison. Some guys would give desperate people a strong dose of spice just to watch them freak out. They called it a man down. The people would have seizures, foam at the mouth, vomit, and the others would terrorize them. They'd cover them in shower gel, strip them down, just being cruel in general. The worst cases shut down the whole wing, and paramedics had to come in with the full treatment, sometimes even an adrenaline shot to the heart like in that movie. If you ever find yourself in prison, no matter how boring it gets, never accept drugs from anyone, especially spice. Story 21. Okay, so picture this. I live in the state of Colorado. It's lockdown time after 11 p.m. Me and my cellmate are locked in, just talking and hanging out. He had taken Seroquel, so he was asleep within 30 minutes. About an hour or two later, I'm up in my rack, rotating between reading a book and listening to my radio. At that time, there was a man on the block named Tron. Anyway, I'm reading, and he starts telling this wild story. Here's how he told it. It's nighttime in his neighborhood, and he's outside in a parking lot smoking a cigarette. An SUV pulls up with a bunch of guys he doesn't recognize. Apparently, it was one of their birthdays. They all thought Tron was a woman because he takes hormones, talks like a woman, and looks like one. They asked him to come to their hotel room to chill and smoke. Once there, all four of them started talking with Tron, and he agreed to do something for money. One guy took out his phone and filmed it. About an hour later, that guy got a call from his big homie, who was furious. He told him, "You're in violation. You're done." The guy was confused until his homie told him that the person they were with was not a woman. So the guy hangs up and confronts Tron. Tron says, "Yeah, I'm a man." "What are you going to do about it?" Two of the guys left in shame. The other two stayed and decided to continue anyway. These were supposedly street guys. Story 22. UK here was in a YOI, Young Offenders Institution, ages 18 to 21. Living conditions were poor, defenseless individuals mixed with aggressive ones everywhere. I watched three guys spend hours at their cell doors shouting at another guy in his cell, telling him he was worthless and pathetic and should just end it all. That led to him actually attempting to take his own life. Things like that were so common, I honestly can't say whether he survived or not. I don't remember who made it and who didn't. I witnessed around 8 separate hostage situations. The worst was when 2 guys kidnapped a random inmate and held him hostage in an attempt to get transferred to a prison closer to their homes. This wasn't uncommon, since many inmates were located hundreds of miles from family and never received visits. But in this case, both guys lost focus and began to humiliate and hurt the victim. He was quiet and humble and had done nothing to either of them. They tied him to a chair and placed him on the top bunk, telling the negotiator at the cell door that if anyone tried to breach the cell, they'd push him off headfirst onto the concrete. They stripped him, made him sing humiliating songs, and destroyed his personal belongings, photos and letters from home. I saw one guy force another to kiss his feet in the showers, for no reason. When he rightly refused, about 5 others jumped him and beat him badly. The things you see in there are unreal. The stories you hear are almost unbelievable, but there's always a grain of truth. I could list story after story. I probably don't even remember the worst ones right now. Story 23. I heard a disturbing story from a prison guard who was a client of mine. He told me about inmates at the facility complaining about loud animal-like screams at night. Nobody could figure out what it was or whose cell it was coming from. The guards did their rounds but came up empty every time. One night, the guards waited until they heard the sounds and followed them. Apparently, a house cat had wandered into the prison yard, and an inmate managed to sneak it into his cell. The screaming was coming from that cat, but the noise was so intense and unnatural that it didn't even sound like an animal. When they followed the sound to the source, they discovered one of the most disturbing things they had ever seen. The inmate was hiding the cat in his bunk, and that night, when they arrived, they caught him abusing the animal. The guard told me the image was burned into his memory and he would never forget it. Story 24. Someone kept begging this guy who loved Little Debbie oatmeal cream pies to just put the head in. I had to listen to that nonsense every night until I finally told them to take it somewhere else. I tried to stay cool in there, but that was too much. Then one night I heard, "Ow, that was the whole thing." Unreal. One of my close friends, someone I was tight with, got neglected by the nurse. He was white, she was black. There was a lot of tension and unfairness like that. I'm not racist at all, even with everything I've seen, because I take people as individuals, not by groups. But the way some people acted inside didn't reflect everyone on the outside, and I judge case by case. Anyway, long story short, he went to the nurse like 10 times over 3 days, complaining of intense stomach pain. She said it was gas and sent him back to his bunk. He didn't eat or move for 3 days. Finally, I grabbed a CO I trusted, and thankfully, he was one of the decent ones. I explained everything and showed him my friend. He immediately called an ambulance. I later found out my friend died the next day at the hospital from complications, from a burst appendix. Nobody should die from that anymore. You know how painful that must have been? And he just sat there and suffered. They ruled it Complications. But if he'd been sent earlier, he would have lived. That nurse is a killer in my eyes. I've seen her send black inmates out for far less. And of course, there were the usual stabbings and fights over debts, gambling, drugs, food. Sometimes it was about being too loud, being weak, or showing off. Most of the time, it was deserved. Not always, though. One time, a small white kid walked into the wrong bathroom at the wrong time. Gotta be careful. He didn't know any better. It was full of gang members he didn't belong near. I grabbed his shoulder and yanked him out of there. I had just enough respect to avoid getting jumped for doing that. I usually stayed out of things, but he was so new and small, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. He stuck to me after that. Turned out he was hilarious. I know how to be miserable in there. I don't need help with that. Make me laugh? That's rare, and he did. Funny how things work out sometimes. Story 25. Things to know about U.S. prisons. The prisoners pretty much run them. They clean, do all the clerical work, as well as the cooking, painting, and maintaining the plumbing and electrical systems. Second, it's a totally different world in there. As soon as you arrive, you have to instantly adopt a racist mindset. You stick with your own race, and if something goes down, you better be fighting for your race. Otherwise, your own group will just watch another race hurt you without warning. And honestly, I feel like that's a big part of why racism continues. So many people get conditioned to live that way and speak that way, and when they call home and talk with their kids, it's passed on. They get out and use slurs and just keep it going. You can't just turn off that way of thinking at the gate. From the moment you arrive, you are segregated. It took me about a year to finally stop thinking like that. Some don't even bother trying because they're doing life on the installment plan. Everything is done for you. Food, clean clothes, and bedding. There are no choices. If you spend more than a few years inside, the pace of change out here can feel overwhelming. Some people get out and can't handle it. That's why some will just go rob a liquor store and sit out front drinking a bottle, waiting for the cops, so they can go back in. It's too overwhelming for them. Story 26. Never been to prison, but all throughout high school I was in and out of psych wards, which I've learned are run far too similarly to prisons in the U.S. If you're under 18, you're put in the children's ward, which meant you'd have 16-year-old kids like me with 11-year-olds who were sent in for inappropriate behavior. This time, I had come in on a weekend following a suicide attempt. That meant I couldn't see a doctor or therapist for at least 3 days since staff had weekends off. So I was already frustrated. We weren't allowed to speak to nurses, and the techs barely did more than tell us to shut up and keep quiet in front of the TV. I befriended a 13-year-old kid I'll call Trent. He was very soft-spoken and had scars all over his arms and face from a previous attempt. One morning while brushing our teeth, he complained to me about the toothpaste. A tech yelled at him to shut up. I was already frustrated. It had been a full week and I still hadn't spoken to anyone about my treatment or release. So I said, "Okay, Sean, if you want to pick on someone, pick on me. I'm your size and you know I'd stand up to you." Sean backed off, but a bunch of techs came out trying to get me to calm down. I kept speaking up. "Don't tell these kids to shut up. They've been through enough. Who cares about toothpaste? You don't care about us. If we wanted to hurt ourselves before, we definitely do now." One tech responded, "Maybe you should." I lost it. I threw my hygiene bucket at Sean and made it clear. If they wanted me to act like an animal, I would. 6 on-site officers came and gave me 2 options. Go into the isolation room or get sedated. I agreed to go, said I was too uptight, but that what they were doing was wrong. They laughed. Once in the room, they grabbed me, forced me on the bed. I protested because I thought going in voluntarily meant no harm. One officer choked me with both hands. I tried to say I couldn't breathe. He said, "If you can talk, you can breathe," and choked harder. I tried to spit but was too weak. He started punching me. They strapped me down. A nurse came in and gave me an injection. They pulled my pants down, exposed me completely, then pulled my paper underwear back up after injecting me. The sedation didn't calm my mind. It only paralyzed my body. I couldn't move or sleep. About 20 minutes later, a man came in with papers and water. He said he was there to help, but I had to sign a form saying the hospital protected my rights. He said if I signed, he'd give me water and remove 1 strap per hour. If not, no water until morning. I was still strapped, sedated, Before I could answer, he said, "Here, I'll sign it for you," and moved my hand to scribble my name. I was in there for 6 hours and got water maybe twice. I had called 911 on myself. I wanted help. After 2 weeks, I spent the rest of the time in isolation. I saw my doctor once for 2 minutes. She wouldn't let me speak and told me they could hold me indefinitely. I told her I'd rather die than stay there. She left. I followed, yelling, demanding to be released. That was the scariest part, how quickly I became someone willing to be violent. I was always quiet, and my aggression was only turned inward. But that place changed me. It showed me how the system in America doesn't help. It creates people who don't know how to function in the outside world, especially when mental health isn't a priority. Story 27. I'm a nurse in a women's prison. A couple of weeks before I started the job, there was an inmate on one-to-one supervision due to mental health issues. She had been talking about how God told her she needed to make a sacrifice in order to reach heaven. That sacrifice? Her own eyes. While on 24/7 supervision, she somehow managed to rip out one of her own eyeballs while the nurse watching her screamed for the COs to open the door. It was too late. The eye was completely removed. Months later, after recovering, she was again placed on one-to-one watch for threatening to remove the other one. I was assigned to watch her on occasion. I hated those shifts. The nurse who originally witnessed the first incident never came back to work. The whole thing was just heartbreaking. Story 28. The craziest and worst things I ever saw in prison were not the often bloody or violent inmate-on-inmate fights, nor the physical or psychological abuse inmates experienced at the hands of corrections officers. That was a daily occurrence. The most shocking stuff? There were no cameras in the dorms to monitor inmates. You'd only see a guard during count, or if you were being escorted somewhere. Count happened every 6 to 8 hours. The only cameras in the dorms were the personal body cams of corrections officers. The main laundry building burned down while I was there. The inmates outnumbered the guards by a huge margin, at least at the state female max security prison I was in. The violence and chaos were so frequent due to the lack of supervision. In jail prior to prison, I saw things that broke my heart. One officer, who to my knowledge still works at that jail, received only a 6-month paid leave and was removed from the CERT, anti-riot squad team, as discipline for her actions. Her mistakes involved using her taser on 4 inmates while they were in the shower, killing them. The CERT team is called in when an inmate is non-compliant for any reason, refusing to stop a behavior, not going back to their cell, failing to understand a directive, or simply not leaving the shower area at the end of our 1 hour of free time. That 1 hour was all we had to choose between calling home or trying to get a warm shower before the hot water ran out. Non-compliance is entirely at the discretion of the housing unit deputy. This officer used her taser on 4 separate people while they were naked, wet, and standing in running water. All 4 had mental health conditions, and at least 2 didn't speak English, so they didn't even understand what they were being told to do. They all died of heart attacks in that small shower stall, terrified and confused. Instead of waiting for them to turn off the water and comply, she used the taser, multiple times. Eventually, she was removed from the CERT team and given 6 months paid leave. But she's still working and still carries a taser. There's so much more. It's so bad. Human rights violations happen daily in American prisons and jails. Story 29. I haven't been in prison, but I got locked up in jail once for being caught with weed and for attempting to buy magic mushrooms. The next morning before I got released, they put me back in the general holding cell at the front. At the same time, a cop was doing my paperwork, and another guy got placed in the same cell with me. I noticed he was fiddling with something in his hand or pocket, but I didn't really understand what was going on. I was still in shock after spending the night in jail. The guy was holding something that resembled a chain of blades, and in hindsight, I believe he was planning to attack or stab me with it. We were the only ones in there at that moment. Luckily, the cop looked up and noticed him fidgeting. He immediately got up, unlocked the gate, and took him down fast. He beat the guy up and took the blade from him. I got out without any harm done, but that was one of the few times in my life when I was fully aware of how close I came to dying, especially over something as trivial as Mari possession as a 22-year-old kid. Story 30. I don't know if this fits exactly. It's not a story about jail or prison, but rather about a mental health center for children with special needs. My uncle was there for a while when I was little. He had hurt his head as a child and was mentally disabled, so he has some pretty wild stories. In the beginning, when he told my grandparents about what the staff and guards did there, they didn't believe him. He stayed there from Monday to Friday, and my grandparents would pick him up on the weekends. They weren't locked up during the day, but at night they locked the exits and their rooms so they wouldn't wander. During the day, they had lots of activities and learning. It was like a school for children with special needs. Well, my uncle would say the guards would get drunk and beat him and the other kids with fists, belts, and sometimes worse. He mentioned that some kids were assaulted, though thankfully not him. Because of all that, many of the kids grew frustrated and started fighting among themselves, thinking that violence was normal because the guards treated them that way. One time, my uncle came home with a broken arm, full of bruises and bite marks. One of the kids had bitten him, and then the guards broke his arm and beat him until he was purple. The place was eventually shut down. I don't remember if any charges were pressed against those guards. I can't imagine what kind of person would hurt someone like my uncle or the other kids. They're really sweet and innocent people, and even though they're adults, because of their conditions, they act like children and have the mental age of kids. Those people who hurt them were absolutely disgusting and inhuman. They deserve serious consequences for what they did. Story 31. I was a correctional officer. I think the hardest part for inmates was the routine. Most people in maximum security weren't folks who worked a 9-to-5 job and just happened to make a mistake. In general, they had already been through the system for years, with their behavior escalating until they reached us. Maximum security requires routine, strict adherence to rules, and constant observation of behavior. If people start hoarding food or passing certain kites, we know something is going on. To recognize patterns like that, we have to follow very detailed routines. Lights out at a specific hour, lights on at 5:30 a.m. For the inmates, most had never really held steady jobs or lived by any schedule. Now they had to live by ours, and there's no room for breaking those rules. To them, it feels like control, but we also know that to end up there, they didn't just get unlucky. They committed serious crimes, often involving violence, and were still a threat to others. I worked with men who openly admitted that if they ever got out, they would definitely kill again. One inmate threatened to assault a nurse right in front of me, just because he couldn't think of anything else to say. Another had no remorse for multiple murders and blamed his victims for being born. And yet they all felt like they were the victims, being incarcerated and made to follow rules. How unfair. The closest I ever came to using a weapon was in a hospital. I later reflected on how I almost opened fire in a crowded room. That's when I realized I couldn't do that kind of job for the rest of my life. Prison is not fun. Story 32. Not jail, but when I was arrested for weed, I was taken to a holding cell at the local precinct. A few hours in, the cops brought in another prisoner and placed him in the cell next to mine. The guy was pretty upbeat and tried to make conversation, even suggesting I hang up a paper curtain for privacy. He seemed like a regular guy who just wanted to talk. I wasn't in the mood, so I gave short answers and mostly ignored him. Later on, he started having full conversations with himself in different voices, at least 5 that I could identify. It was very unsettling. Anyway, the next day the cops woke me up and told me a transport vehicle was coming to take us to court. The guy in the next cell refused to leave, insisting he was innocent. After a couple of minutes of pleading, he suddenly became verbally aggressive. They had to call in a special response team, not quite SWAT, but close, to remove him. Definitely a strange 24-hour experience. Story 33. There was a loud buzz from the wall next to the locked door, like an amplified beehive. Then some muffled speech. I was asleep. It was around 3 a.m. My cellmate had the bottom bunk. He was a big, quiet guy and could do more push-ups than me. He thumped the bottom of my bunk and said, "That's for you. You're getting out." I was still groggy, but I grabbed my stuff. Turns out my uncle had posted bond. He was standing outside next to his son's Mustang. His first words were, "You little punk." I'm not that little. He lit us both cigarettes. I was trying not to cry. I was so happy, confused about how I'd gotten out, and wondering where my parents were. It was a weird mix of feelings, but it was a beautiful night in Baltimore. My cousin was in the back seat and smiled, asking if I liked the mystery meat sandwiches. He'd been locked up there before. I told him they worked great as pillows. Jail messes with your mind. When I got out, it felt like the world was suddenly huge, full of wind and night smells. It was embarrassingly glorious. My parents got back in town and hired a great attorney. I got off with a suspended sentence and had to stay clean for 2 years. Story 34. I had a guy ask me to draw a colored pencil picture of his girlfriend. I nailed the likeness. It ended up looking practically photographic. After several weeks of trying to collect payment from him for the canteen items he promised, he finally told me he wasn't going to pay. I smiled and calmly said, "Okay then." I was getting tired of chasing the debt anyway. I talked to a few other inmates about the situation and eventually ended up speaking with a lifer covered in tattoos linked to a certain prison gang. He offered to handle the situation for 3 cartons of name-brand cigarettes. The guy who owed me ended up getting cornered in the prison kitchen and was severely beaten with a large aluminum stew ladle. He ended up in a coma, and after 90 days on life support, he passed away. I'm not saying I caused his death. Apparently, he'd ripped off others too. The guy who carried out the beating spent 90 days in segregation, fully stocked with cigarettes, and was then returned to general population like nothing happened. No charges were ever filed. Story 35. An officer stood beside me as I was being processed. Fingerprinted, evaluated, personal items taken. The man in front of me took off his shoes and the smell was unreal. Absolutely overwhelming, I gagged. I can't handle bad odors, but the officers didn't even react. When he finally moved through intake, a janitor came out and mopped the floor where his feet had been. I can't even imagine what the tank he was sent to smelled like, especially since some were standing room only. I also saw a man pull a cell phone from beneath his waistband and start playing music on it. Earlier, I had to squat and cough as part of the intake process, which should have expelled any hidden contraband. That guy must have had a steel trap level of control. Honestly, I was more impressed than disturbed. The music was actually decent. Credit where credit's due. Story 36. I've never been to prison, but this is from a family member who had been. It's more of a light story than anything dark. He was a pretty likable guy inside and learned quickly that being friendly went a long way. He ended up becoming friends with another inmate and arranged to be cellmates with him. It was the devil you know kind of logic. This was in a federal max security facility. One day, his new cellie came back from the mess hall with a tray. He opened the cover, stared at the food, then threw the entire tray against the cell wall. He started shouting for the CO, yelling, "Everyone is supposed to get 6 chicken nuggets. I got 5. So now they had a mess all over the only little 8x10 space that felt like home. I guess it's just like life on the outside. You think you know someone, and then something small sets them off. I'm just glad he's out now, has a job and a support system. Story 37. Honestly, all the violence and stupid gang stuff aside, the most messed up thing I experienced was the lack of staff, 24-hour lockdowns, and going without food for 8 days. When we finally got food, it was just a quarter portion of half-cooked black beans. The cells were about 8 by 5 feet and overcrowded, usually with 3 people, one sleeping on the floor. There were holes in the walls and no heat in winter. The heat in summer was worse than an oven. We had no outdoor access, just indoor pods. There was one small, 1/4 size basketball court only allowed for 25 people at a time, and our pod held over 90 inmates. They even removed the frosted glass in some areas to prevent us from seeing outside. So that was the last sunlight we ever saw. I caught meningitis while I was in there. If I screamed or made noise because of the unbearable pain from brain swelling, they just locked me in the hole. And then came the staph infections that everyone got. That's the environmental part. But what really messed me up was the psychological part. Being trapped in those 24-hour lockdowns with no staff around. A young man in a few cells over ended his life. All we could hear was gurgling, crying, and him asking for his mom. The only thing we could do was roll over and try to stuff the dirty clothes we used as pillows into our ears. A couple of people yelled and banged on doors, but no one came. We had to wait until morning for them to find him. Then came more lockdown, months of it. They took away the phones and mail to keep it from getting outside. Some of the guards were people I knew from the deli I worked at as a kid. They couldn't take it either and quit. They told me even they felt like they were in lockdown. Things got so bad from food shortages that it almost caused riots. Eventually they brought trays, but they were still the kind of food you'd expect in the poorest countries. Families were charged ridiculous amounts just to send us food, on top of the $2.85 per day we had to pay to rent our cell. I was there on a felony traffic violation, just a broke college kid. They flipped the charge into something more serious because I had no money. That landed me in maximum security with shady classifications. I ended up learning more than I ever wanted, from people locked up for everything from armed robbery and trafficking to murder. Now I have severe PTSD, bipolar disorder, and I've become someone more intense, more anxious. If you try to corner me, doesn't matter if it's a badge or just an old man from across the street, it feels like I'm going to die. I can't handle confined spaces. I lost my future in science, and I've gained trust issues I may never shake. Story 38. My wife's cousin went to jail in 1997. He got out more than a year ago. After 6 months of being free, he turned himself in and confessed to a murder he had committed back in 1996. When we asked him why, he said the world had changed so much. He didn't know how to live in it anymore. To clarify, he was 18 when he went in. He took the fall for a crime technically committed by his 17-year-old brother, though his brother did time as an accessory. But being 18, he took the full hit. After decades behind bars, he didn't know who he was anymore outside of prison. He also said that the world had evolved too much. It was overwhelming. When I said he got away with murder, I meant the police had essentially closed the case. He had always been a suspect, but there was never any evidence. He could have just committed a minor offense to get back in, but instead, he chose the nuclear option. He walked into a police station and confessed. He definitely did it. His best friend, my brother, had passed away, and he was grieving. The person he murdered had said the wrong thing at the wrong time, and that was it. Story 39. It's kind of weird. I have to admit the reason I asked is because I'm a recovering addict, used all sorts of drugs for 2 years, and hero for 3 more years. Clean now for 5.5 years. When I finally got sober after using hard drugs every day for 5 years, it felt like the world had changed completely. Even watching commercials on TV felt strange. I was really into sports before I started using, and suddenly I didn't know who any of the players were. It was wild having to relearn every league, NBA, NHL, NFL, and MLB. The saddest part was realizing I barely knew my 3-year-old niece. I had no memories of her between 0 and 3 years old, but I've tried hard to make up for it over the past 5 years. That's part of why I asked the question. I figured it would be interesting to hear what people who did even longer stretches had to say. Imagine coming out after 20 years. Someone who once had a huge old cell phone with an antenna would now see iPhones with facial recognition and retina scanners. It would feel like stepping into the future. Story 40. I haven't served a prison sentence, but I'm a correctional officer at a state penitentiary in Texas. My unit releases about 75 people a day, Monday through Friday. I work weekends doing visitation and talk to a lot of the guys who are days away from getting out. Most of them can't even imagine what life will be like, just from what they see on TV. They talk about how much their hometowns have changed, how places they once knew are now gone. Several times a year, we have people who've spent decades locked up and don't know how to live outside anymore. So they commit crimes just to come back. Just last week, we were preparing to release a 60-year-old man who had been in for 40 years. The day before his release, he tied razor blades to a shoestring and cut another inmate's neck open. When asked why, he said, "This is my home. I'm not leaving my home." Story 41. A friend of mine growing up did a long sentence. He was the same age as me, same birthday, just 12 hours apart. We were in school together, Cub Scouts, all that. But around middle school, we drifted apart, and I never saw him in high school, though he later said he remembered me from then. Anyway, I was working at the library when he came in. He had just gotten out of a long prison term, a local one at that, so you'd think it wouldn't be that isolating. But apparently he'd burned a lot of bridges by that point, so he didn't get many visitors. The local prison doesn't exactly have current books or magazines, and apparently the TV choices were terrible. What can I say? We live in the Deep South. He was most amazed by the changes in technology. He knew about computers and cell phones, but had almost no hands-on experience. He struggled to adjust and manage basic things. He'd been in and out of jail and prison since high school, so for the past 20 years, he'd had very little real contact with the outside world. He couldn't really cope. One night, he took an old pickup truck, drank just enough to feel brave, and slammed it into the courthouse in the middle of the night. He died and caused a small fire. A year later, you can't even see a mark on the courthouse wall, and he's just a memory now. Story 42 got out last month, was in for 17 years. Drugs. Whenever I type a question about professional wrestling, trying to catch up into Google, I seem to land on this website, and I saw this question. People had cell phones in prison, so the tech itself isn't that unfamiliar. But the level of accessibility now, that's what throws me. 2 nights ago, I bought a prepaid debit card just to order pizza online from a Domino's 2 blocks away. That felt wild. I want to try Uber next for no real reason. I think I just hate talking on the phone. Either I'm just really happy to be out, or everyone else seems some shade of miserable now. Maybe it's just because it's winter, I don't know. But people seem unhappier than they did when I went in. I stopped by this basketball court, Chunok Park I used to go to almost daily growing up, and now it's just empty. I don't live in a big town or anything, but it used to have people out and about. Downtown had stores and foot traffic. Now, no stores and barely anyone walking around. That part made me a little sad. Story 43. My mom's cousin was locked up for 36 years. He committed murder when he was 20 and got out at 56 for good behavior. He knew about iPods, iPhones, all that. They have TV and newspapers in prison. But what really threw him off was how distant people were out in the real world. When he went in, if someone was busy, they'd hold up a newspaper. Now it's earbuds, phone screens, or just not acknowledging anyone. He struggled with those nonverbal cues that everyone else picks up subconsciously, but he couldn't because of prison life. Another shocker was how the career he was training for before the murder, records management, was totally obsolete thanks to computers. He ended up working as a solo electrician because nobody else would hire him once they did a background check. The biggest issue he has now is explaining the last 40 years of his life. If someone says, "You new around here?" he can't say he grew up there because they'd quickly catch on. Remember Roscoe's on 5th? No, he doesn't. That place opened in 1989 and closed in 2003. He was locked up from 1979 to 2005. And then there are big life events. Where were you on September 11th? When the market crashed? When the Red Sox won the World Series? He was in prison and can't say that unless absolutely necessary. Story 44. I knew a guy who had been in for around 35 years. He went in weighing 400 pounds and came out completely transformed, built and stacked. He had a master's degree in chemistry and was convicted for creating explosives for a radical fringe group. After getting out, he seemed fairly normal and even tried to get a job in his field. Some agency out west that did government work was willing to hire him. They told him his record didn't matter, but the job required him to live on site, out in the middle of the desert, and according to him, he would have had to stay for years with no option to leave. He declined. One odd thing that came up often for him was job applications asking whether he had been convicted of a felony in the last 20, 25, 30 years. He would always check no, which was technically true even though he had just gotten out. Eventually, he took a job abroad teaching English, set up through an agency. He moved to China for a few years, married a woman there who was half his age and treated him terribly. They came back to the US, and not long after, he developed a drug addiction and passed away from cancer. After years of calm and rebuilding, things turned dark very quickly. Story 45. The world just seemed to get bigger, faster, and a lot less kind. What struck me the most was that some of the nicest people I'd ever known were inside prison, yet once I got out, being respectful or asking a question would get me judged, dismissed, or looked down on before I could even finish a sentence. It was strange how prison politics had taught me manners, but outside it seemed like nobody cared about that anymore. I remember spending hours on YouTube, amazed at how much I could watch for free. Back in the day, I would have had to pay a lot for VHS tapes just to see some of that stuff. Also, applying for jobs changed completely. When I was in a halfway house, we were required to go out daily to look for work. But everywhere I went, I was told that hiring was only done online. I'd go back and tell the staff, and they'd accuse me of just wanting to stay home and play on the computer. It took forever to find a job. Those programs didn't help much, and the parole office no longer had employment centers like they used to in the 90s. That lack of support really messed things up for me, and eventually led to a relapse and falling into old habits again.